Looking back is not what farmers need to be all about. Looking back is not what we need to be all about. We need to be fixed forward around those two requirements: loving God, loving our neighbor. Loving God with all that we are. I think we understand what that means in our heads, but the challenge is sometimes to get that down into the level of our hearts. When I was able to just enjoy General Assembly this year, I noticed that the new moderator had picked a theme hymn. I think it's in our white songbook, if I'm not mistaken. And he asked us to sing a verse or so of that hymn every time we gathered at the start of the meetings, a little time of worship. The song was Raising Our Hands as a Sign of Devotion. And Presbyterians, it's not really kind of easy to get your hands out from under and get them up. And as much as the moderator every day, and even a couple of times a day, got us to sing that song, Raising Our Hands, maybe one hand might go halfway up, or it was really a little bit funny to watch how hard it is for Presbyterians to show their love for God by raising their hands, even when it's right there in the words of the hymn. Yes, we do love God, but we have a difficult time as human beings, maybe as Presbyterians, maybe as Anglo-Saxon Canadians, whatever it is, to love God with all that we are, our heart, our soul, our mind, our strength, with everything that we are. Jesus gives us the guidance, really, for what it means to love God in the way that he loved his Father. Think of any aspect of his ministry. People said of Jesus, he speaks with authority. He speaks as one who seems to intimately know God in heaven when he speaks about him. It's not just that he's quoting somebody. He really seems to know God. He seems to love God, and he teaches and speaks out of that situation. Jesus loved God, his Father, intimately. And so everything he did was an expression of that love. Think of the moment when Jesus was approaching Jerusalem at the end of his ministry. And he knew what was coming. He knew that the cross lay before him. And he knew that Jerusalem, who should have reached out for him as the Messiah, would be the very ones who would say, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." And it says in the shortest verse in the Bible, simply this: Jesus wept. He loved the people of Jerusalem. He loved the people of God because he shared the heart of his Father toward them. He longed that they would turn to him, follow the way of God's kingdom, be God's people. But he knew that would be so hard for them to give their hearts to God entirely, and so he wept over Jerusalem. And then he carried on to show his love for God in the absolute way. Not one, as one of our stained glass windows. No, sorry. That's in another church. I've been to a lot of churches lately. You picture Jesus praying in Gethsemane. Again, his love is expressed so fully. Not my will, but thine be done. Love is not just a kind of mushy, gushy emotion. Love is, first of all, commitment to another person, or a commitment to God. Not my will, but thine be done. That was the ultimate expression of Jesus' love for his Father, that he was willing to turn himself, his life, his purposes over to God the Father in heaven. Love God with all that you are, the first and greatest commandment. I think I will always remember, whether I get back to Ghana and West Africa again or not, how much they love their God and how open they are to expressing exuberantly and enthusiastically their love for God. How much they love soccer as well. Did anybody watch Ghana beat the United States yesterday? Go! I have to admit I was kind of cheering for Ghana. Definitely the underdog. To express our love fully. To think about how crazy those soccer fans are in South Africa, yelling and screaming and dancing. Why should we be any less exuberant and enthusiastic in our love for God? He has given us life, life in fullness, life eternal. Love God with all that you are, the first and greatest requirement of God's people. Secondly, love your neighbor as yourself. I think it's very important to realize the context again in which Jesus said these words. Again, as Jesus was always trying to be trapped by his opponents. This happened again one day, and they came up to him and said, "Who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor anyway? You say I should love my neighbor as myself. Well, who is that person?" And so Jesus told the very well-known story of the Good Samaritan to define who neighbor is in our lives. You know the story very well. The man is beaten up on the side of the road on his way to Jericho, and 3 people come walking by him. The first comes up to him, and the story tells us that this person is a religious leader, perhaps a Pharisee, a Jewish religious leader. So he might be, in our way of thinking, the minister of the local Presbyterian church, a very religious gentleman. He comes by and he says, "I really probably should help that person lying in the gutter beside the road. After all, I am religious and I know all the laws and such, but the people are waiting for me at Tweedsmuir Presbyterian Church. It's 25 after 10 and they want me to start worship at 10:30, and if I'm not there on time, well, I don't know what they'll do. They'll probably fire me." And so he thought maybe he should help, but he walked by on the other side because he had religious obligations. And Jesus says another person walked by, and this was more of a lawyer type of person. Perhaps a religious lawyer, or perhaps just someone who should know right and wrong by the rules of the Old Testament. But this person said, "Well, maybe what I should do is pull out my blue book, my book of forms," which in Presbyterian settings tells all the laws and the rules, and flip through the page. What does it say about finding a beaten up man on the side of the road? Well, I don't think it's in the book of forms. So, I better pass by on the other side. And then comes a Samaritan. The first 2 were Jewish people, leaders, recognizable people in Jewish society. But the third person is not a respectable person at all. He's a Samaritan, the type of person that the Jewish people would have nothing to do with. They were long, distant cousins, but they had been squabbling for centuries. Jews had nothing to do with Samaritans, but yet it's a Samaritan that comes by, the third man, bows down, helps this man. We all know the parable so well. Takes him to the inn, pays for him there, pays for the doctor's bill. And then Jesus says, who was this man's neighbor? Was it the religious man that should have known right? Was it the legal man that should have known right? Or was it the Good Samaritan? They simply nodded their heads. Love your neighbor as yourself. Care for your neighbor's needs that are right there in front of you. Set your sights ahead. Don't look back. Don't keep looking back for rules or suggestions that might allow us to skirt around our neighbor's needs. To look ahead. To fix our sights not just on God, but also on our neighbor. When you came into church this morning, maybe some of you aren't exactly sitting right beside somebody, but do you ever think about coming into church, yes, to love God, but also perhaps to some loving way, find out about the need of your neighbor? Do you listen carefully to the person in the pew beside you when they have something to say about a need? When you don't go downstairs for coffee, do you only talk about the weather? Or do you tune in somehow or other to the need of a neighbor? Or perhaps a new person that's sitting in the corner and nobody's talking to them and they're wondering, maybe I'll come back to Tweedsmuir, maybe I won't. Do we sense the needs of our neighbor? We had a wonderful feed of strawberries this week, and I think every person who came would have recognized that their need was satisfied, at least for strawberries. And the welcome that they received when they came, I'm sure, was very encouraging as well. But that's just the start. Maybe we should have a strategy. Feed people strawberries, get them in the door of church. But that's only the start. Then comes the welcome. Then comes the care for neighbor. Finding out the deepest needs of our neighbor and being willing to set ourselves aside to meet those needs.